Ladies and Gentlemen, es ist eine Veranstaltung, liebe Kollegen, liebe Gäste, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, es ist eine Veranstaltung heute, die wir in englischer Sprache haben. Wir haben Gäste aus dem Ausland, von dem her werde ich jetzt ins Englische wechseln. Ladies and Gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you to our panel with the title New Infrastructure for Mobility and Transforming Basel and its Trinational Region. Sorry, the slide doesn't work. Is it? Es läuft noch nicht. Okay, thank you. It's a panel which we organized with the BSA, the Bund Schweizer Architekten, in Basel, together with the SCA, mainly presented here, and of course also the University for Applied Science, Fachhochschule Nordwestschweiz, FHNW in Basel and Basel-Land and Aargau. We all know Basel as a city with intense use of public space and intense use of soft mobility. A pedestrian city where the public riverfront is very heavily used, mainly during summertime, where the tram is very prominent and very present from both parts of the region, from Basel-Land and Basel-Stadt. We also already do have some contemporary infrastructure for soft mobility, like park and ride stations at train stations, at the main station at Basel, SBB for example, or like for smaller stations like the one at St. Johann in the northern part of Basel. But at the same time, Basel still is a city where, for different reasons, we would also like maybe to elaborate on today, new infrastructure projects do have quite a big difficulty to be established. For example, like 2 years ago, there was an initiative for a new infrastructure project called Veloring, which would have proposed a new contemporary infrastructure for bikes around the city, with introducing also a new bike lane and a new bridge, which was voted down by public by quite a large amount. And we are now in a moment where a lot of very large-scale infrastructure projects are being planned, such as the S-Bahn Herzog, which probably we're also going to talk about later today, with a connection then later to the Oyo airport, but also now completing the highway ring around Basel with a new tunnel underneath the Rhine Tunnel, or the cargo terminal with a new water basin where the goods coming from Holland and from Rotterdam and Amsterdam will be more easily transported and reloaded to the train. At the same time, we are facing a construction boom, and we have a large-scale urban transformation ahead of us, which is about 113 hectares, the equivalent of maybe 113 football fields, while astonishingly enough, the estimation for demographic growth is quite not low, but not very high at the same time. So we talk about right now an estimation about 20,000 inhabitants, and as already now always a larger growth of workplaces during the next 20-25 years to come. So if we look at the transformation areas which are distributed all over the city, we have different types of transformation areas. For example, the one, probably the biggest one, the Klebeck one, with about 30 hectares, which is mainly a densification and reprogramming of an existing industrial area. While other places, like the one closer to the train station, which used to be former and unused reloading and transfer site, is going to be transformed and densified in a totally new urban quarter, which is not existing today. Looking at research, we know, and even though this is an old demograph, know that compact cities are more efficient. And this is showing the relationship between density and the annual use of petroleum, where we see that Hong Kong and Houston are like on the two far ends. And like this, we also probably could understand all these transformations as a chance for inner growth. I think which is quite a unique situation, that the city is not growing at the outer skirts, but it's mainly growing in these almost like former black holes, and without completely changing the functioning neighborhoods. So for that, we think it's definitely the right moment and the right place to discuss the role and the potential of mobility infrastructure. And for this, I would like to hand over the microphone to my colleague Manuel Herz, which will now introduce the speakers and the guests of tonight. Thank you.
No, you go.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for this introduction. I'm very happy to have a wonderful audience, a wonderful panel, a wonderful group of guests here and speakers that I want to briefly introduce to you and then hand over. I will start with our guest who has come from more furthest away. We have Jan Gehl. Jan Gehl is an architect and a professor and consultant on urban design based in Copenhagen. He has focused his career on improving the quality of urban life. I like this sentence very much. He has focused his career on improving the quality of urban life by reorienting the design of cities towards the people in the cities, towards pedestrians, cyclists, and public life. He has authored many books, including by now the classic Life Between Buildings and Cities for People, that have been published in more than 40 languages. He co-founded the planning office Gehl Architects, which has pursued major urban planning proposals in cities such as Copenhagen, Melbourne, Sydney, London, New York, and Moscow. And Jan Gehl has been awarded many honorary doctoral degrees and is a professor of urban design in Copenhagen and a guest professor at universities around the world. Let's then continue with Christian Egeler to Jan's right. Christian Egeler is an engineer with a specialization in the fields of traffic planning and public transport. He studied at the ETH Zurich and worked for many years in the engineering firm Rapp-Gruppe within the Department of Traffic and Infrastructure Design. He then switched into the public sector and for the last 4 years has been heading the section Traffic, Verkehr in the Federal Office for Spatial Development in Bern, Arre. In this function, he's working on the coordination of transport systems for the whole of Switzerland. Christian Egeler has also a long political career as a member and even head of the cantonal parliament in Basel, but today, and this is important, he is here in his professional function and not in his political role, and we will try very hard to take advantage of this distinction. To his right, Alexander Erath is a professor and head of the Department of Transport and Mobility at the Institute of Engineering at the FHNW, the University of Applied Sciences of Northwestern Switzerland. Prior to this, he worked at the Future Cities Laboratory at the ETH Zurich based in Singapore and founded the research-oriented consulting company RWCO. The main interest of his research work is the survey and modeling of traffic behavior, as well as the development and application of new digital planning tools for traffic. In addition to teaching in the bachelor's program at the FHNW, he also teaches at the ETH within the framework of the Masters of Advanced Studies called Mobilities of the Future. We are very excited. And then finally, to my right, Pierre de Meuron doesn't need much of an introduction, certainly not in the city. Together with Jacques Herzog, he co-founded the architecture office of Herzog de Meuron, which has become one of the most innovative and influential architectural offices in the world, working on extremely diverse set of projects, from housing to cultural buildings, to master plans, to infrastructure across the globe. Together with Jacques Herzog, he has been a professor at Harvard and at the ETH Zurich, where he co-founded an Institute of Urban Research, ETH Studio Basel, that investigates the relationship between the territory and the built-up fabric of cities on the one hand, and the cultural, political and economical dimension of regions on the other hand. Much of this research has focused on Switzerland and how cities and their hinterland correlate by means of, for example, transport, food and energy. Amongst the many books that Pierre has published, I could mention Switzerland, an Urban Portrait, The Inevitable Specificity of Cities, or the Metro Basel comic. What we want to do today is, as Simon already mentioned, to discuss the notion of mobility and future developments of mobility in relationship to urban transformation. We want to take a look at exemplary situations from the outside of Switzerland, and then have a certain focus on the Swiss condition and on the tri-national region of the metropolitan Basel, as this is particularly challenging. How do you design, how do you plan something in a region that lies in 3 countries, 2 languages, 2 economies, 3 economies, and so on? We will start with 2 presentations, first by Gehl with a view from the outside, then by Pierre de Meuron with a more Swiss-based perspective, and then I will give you a bit of a nudge when you're approaching your time limit, and then have a discussion which at the very end will open to the plenum. So let's start with Jan. Thank you.
"15 minutes maximum." That would be the longest 15 minutes in my life. About the future of cities, there are quite a bit of confusion. I was at a conference in Mumbai, in India, and this was a poster, and I went around with the poster and said, "Is this the future or is this the past?" Everybody said, "Oh, that is the future." And I said, "Oh, holy Moses, it looked like Atlanta, Georgia in the 70s. Then I was at another conference which should be more safe. That was UN Habitat. And they had exactly the same poster, but now with 2 hospitals and 6 windmills. Then I was at a conference in Germany for Demenz, of the old people, and here's a stat for Demenz, and that makes me want to die quite early, not to get into something like this. We have a very extremely high hype about automatic cars. When they come, they will solve all the problems we ever had. I have this little image from Ford, and if this is a future, I'm also happy that I'm quite old. And if the automatic cars cannot solve all the problems, then we'll have a number of drones and helicopters which will fill the air and solve the rest of the problems. Oh, holy Moses. Then we have smart cities which will again solve all our problems, except for the guy who cannot find the bicycle lane over there in the middle. There's much hype about this, but characteristic of all these things is that they are selling gadgets in the millions. And the most happy about the automatic cars is definitely the car industry. I was thinking, is this really the future for us in cities? And then I thought about where are the real problems here. The real problems are not in the kind of world where they can afford any of these very expensive gadgets. The problems in the future, will 90% of all the growth in cities will happen in Africa and Southeast Asia, and only a small little percent, as we saw, will be in Basel and in Europe. And these people will have difficulties in enjoying all this new technology. There are places in Europe which could need a little bit of a helping hand. They have a few problems here and there, but the real problems in this world in cities are really in the third world. That's Bangladesh, Dhaka. They will not be able to solve all their problems of bad conscience by having a car which is electro and automatic and car sharing, so they can go to climate demonstration in Germany with this one. Not in Bangladesh in the near future. Already in developing countries, there are problems in finding out enough money. In Bogota, in Colombia, the mayor, Enrique Peñalosa, has put all his money on bike lanes and pedestrian footpaths and let the cars run around in the mud and the gravel. And he say that we will have to use the money cleverly, but not for the rich people only. So all these technological gimmicks will not solve the problem of quality of life in the city. This will always depend on the policies of what we want. I have a guy in the office who has made this little series that say, this is the situation today, completely unacceptable. This is a situation tomorrow where it looks the same, but all of them are now electric. And then the next stage will be when all of them are electric and automatic, but it looks the same. And the point here is that we are waiting for these new technologies to should solve all the problems we ever had. But we always have to apply what we want with the cities. We have to be political. We have to say, is this what we want? Do we want the city to be filled up with new gimmicks and gadgets which can get us around in various smart ways for the cost of quality of life for people? I have, in this case, I have a reflection that maybe we already have a number of ideas and examples. Some could serve as models where we can start right away and which will be almost completely without any expenses. I'll go a little bit back and talk about the big motions in the previous century, the modernism, where suddenly everything, it was the biggest earthquake in the history of human settlements. We were not allowed to do cities anymore. Now we should do freestanding buildings. We went from focusing on spaces where people were moving around to objects where architects could play around. And what was between the buildings was more or less abandoned as an interesting object. This was a fantastic manipulation with qualities of life, and we have struggled ever since to get beyond these two influences. The other big paradigm shift was, of course, the car invasions. I put down 1960, where it really started to roll out, and then it became completely dominating. And also the notion of mobility, getting from A to B, and was more important than what was in A and what was in B. If we go back to 1960, what was known about quality of life for people? Virtually nothing was known. I was trained in the 50s, and when we did all these models of objects, everybody say, man is adaptable, he can adapt to everything, it doesn't matter. We knew not that it mattered. We did not know that it was a massive manipulation with the quality of life for people. The first one to raise an anti-modernistic voice, of course, was Jane Jacobs, and I'll not have time for her today. But she was the first, and that was 1961. My own life, in a very short version, I worked with this, the beginning here is I marry a psychologist who starts to say, why are you architects not interested in people? And that ruined my all what I learned, and I had to start learning something else. Went back to School of Architecture to find out what they did not tell me, just to find out that they didn't know a thing about quality for people. We have to develop the knowledge step by step, which I was part of in the city of Copenhagen. In my case, I have seen how these little modest books about people in cities have been spread all over the world, of which I'm extremely proud and also surprised. But the fact is, there was not this knowledge before, and this has been one of the few sources of this knowledge. Later on, there was this big book, and then, lo and behold, I've started to publish the first books in German, took 40 years, and in French, took also 40 years. And it's not, of course, published in Paris, but published in Montreal. Now we have quite substantial evidence. We have the knowledge. We can make fantastic cities, and we can make fantastic new towns, and we can do fantastic reparations to existing fabric. We have the knowledge. And also now we have other challenges, as increasingly we want a lively, livable city, where we want the public spaces back where we can meet each other, but we also must make a sustainable city, and it's increasingly important that we make cities which invite for healthy lifestyles. So if we look carefully after people in city planning, we will actually find a very simple way to efficiently address all these issues. It will be a lively city, more sustainable, better for health, and a good city to be old in. Then we can ask, are there cities who have taken this up and have done some sustainable work in making the city so that it invites people to walk and bicycle every day, not only on Sundays? Cities all over the world is doing it now. I could invite you, I'll show you some of the cities I've been working in. I could invite you for Melbourne. We started in 1985, and they have a fantastic city architect down there, and they've done wonders in Melbourne. The streetscapes are now like in Paris, but the weather is much better when it's not burning in the woods. And also this guy, when he has finished the work with the center of the city, he starts to go into the suburbs, and he has made a plan how they can double the population of Melbourne without using any more land, just by building along all the transport corridors. Then they can have a doubling of the population. They have to remove 13% of the suburban sprawl, and then they can have everybody in the population could be in walking distance from public transportation and services, just by identifying not high-rise, but 7 stories like in Barcelona. In Sydney, there's been hard work. It looked like this, and it was very nice at the waterfront, but in the main street it was really bad. They've used there, as other places, they've used the light rail, and which was just 2 weeks ago introduced to push the cars out of the city. Now it has been pushed out, and they are also introducing bicycle system. New York, I'll not tell about, but that has been fascinating to see how they have converted so many spaces from auto use to people use. In Vilnius, they are up to a good start, and in Bucharest, they have my book now, so they'll sort out this little mess. Moscow, they heard about these other cities, and then the mayor of Moscow the vice mayor came running up and said, we would like to humanize Moscow, which was a very bad proposition because it was completely ruined by cars. This is Main Street, where they have 1 meter left for people in a city of 14 million on the sidewalk of Main Street, Moscow. And I'll just show you a few little improvements. Here is the sidewalk in Moscow, Main Street before. Here is the sidewalk in Moscow, Main Street, just a year and a half later. Here's a corner near Pushkin Monument, and here's the same corner a couple of years later. In Moscow, they have very efficient democracy. When the mayor say we do this, it happens. They have problems in Moscow also, and I've been over there recently, and they say we now have a new problem. We have Moscow baby boom, and it's your fault because you put up all the benches and the swings and made the public spaces. So now we have a problem. I'm very proud of being reason for that. My main story today, which is not going to be made, is about Copenhagen. They were one of the first to start, and it looked like any other cities in Europe at that point. In 1962 they started, there were big discussions and big skepticism. They made one street, it worked wonderfully. They said we are not Italians, we are Danes, it's too cold. Next year we were Italians, we've been more and more Italians. Now, 55 years later, they've done so much all over the city and also in the inner suburbs and the outer suburbs. They were the first city in the world to have a strategy. We will be the best city in the world for people. And they've done a lot all over the city to do that. And we've seen public life grow year by year. The more you invite, the more they come. Also with bicycle, we've seen that they have done everything to invite bicycling. There's a complete network of safe, good wide bicycle lanes. An efficient transportation system has developed. Every third family has a cargo bike. Even immigrants from Australia can bicycle. And if you're too old to bicycle, you are getting bicycled in your old neighborhood. It's a human right to have wind in your hair when you're old. One of the things they do now is to make so sure, they want again to be the best for bicycle in the world, to make sure that it's always quicker to get from one part of the city to the other by bicycle or by walking. They've done a number of bridges all over the city to link the various sides of the harbor and so on. They even have time to make some nice little things for the bicycles, like a waste paper basket where you can probably hit when you bicycle. There's been an impressive culture of using bicycle gradually developed. There are now 49% of everybody commuting by bicycle. 10 years ago, it was 38%. So, the lesson from Copenhagen, given good invitations, you will have much more walking, more life, and more bicycling. It depends on what you invite for. Now we jump something rather quickly. What is the conclusion here? Cities for what shall we do and what shall we not do? What we shall absolutely not do is Dubai. That is modernism and motorism in a very compressed form. We could, of course, do Venice and put a good subway underneath. That will be focused on on A and B and not going from A to B. But I will suggest why not try the humanistic city planning principle, put people first. It costs very little. It's the simplest and cheapest you can do. It creates better city for all generations, all ages, and it's for all parts of the world, and you can start tomorrow. And you even, with 3 books in German, you can start right away. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
16.
Perfect. Thank you, Jan. This was very impressive, and you showed a very dense presentation of many, many case studies, which will feed our discussion in a little while. I would suggest that we immediately move over to Pierre de Meuron, for your input more from a Swiss perspective.
I don't know. Can you dim down the light, please? Yeah, thanks. I sit. Huh? Okay.
Perfect.
I will not be able to catch up, Manuel, because it's not easy to really to talk about this topic in such a short time. If I have the first thing. Oh, das ist immer mit der Okay. The title, New Infrastructure for Mobility, is, in my view, problematic and misleading, as it suggests that it is sufficient to simply build additional new transport infrastructures in order to serve our growing mobility needs. Therefore, I'd like to complement the title of my keynote speech as follows. For present and future mobility, we need to consider existing infrastructures to even greater extent than new ones. Then it's not just mobility for the sake of mobility, but we have to look for an innovative mobility. First, and this is in the meantime generally acknowledged, that new enlargement, particularly of highways, often not achieve the desired effects. On the contrary, they attract in most of the cases more traffic than before. Second, new infrastructures are notably land-consuming, and in most cases, they come at the expense of the landscape. And thirdly, the construction of tunnels, bridges, and other transport infrastructures requires a great deal of CO2-intensive work and construction materials like concrete and steel. And then third is that it is existing and new infrastructure for an innovative mobility in a livable city. We just heard a lot about that, and that for sure there is a close interrelationship between infrastructure and urban form. There is too an interdependence between mobility needs, mobility behaviors, and the quality of living spaces. There is no mobility, no physical locomotion of people or goods without physical paths, streets, roads, tunnels, bridges, etc. The various modes were only able to progress, the most various traffic modes were only able to progress and flourish along with the continuous construction and expansion of transport infrastructure. As an introduction, I would like to make a short history of the mobility by the example of Basel. Basel is located at the Rhine, which is certainly the spot, the place. That's why people started to live here. And there was certainly also at that time how to go from A to B without cars, with everything. And they invented a really very interesting mode of transportation to cross the river, the so-called Basel-Fährendreieck, where you can take advantage of the low flow on the inside, on the concave side, and the more rapid flow on the outer side of the river. And what is interesting, what at that time was a transportation mode, is now a sport. So it has, I think, a very clever approach in how to do something, how to move people and goods, but also how to take advantage of topographical conditions. Until the 19th century, that was the way as goods, people were transported along and across the Rhine. Till the 13th century, when there was the first bridge was built, the Mittlere Rheinbrücke, which you see here also in an image from the 19th century. Also another quite interesting mode of transport is the Basel Fähre, which also works without any engine and just uses the flow of the river to go from one point of the other one of the city. Then very dramatically was the straightening of the Rhine that was undertaken in the 19th century and made the Rhine shippable up to Basel, and to have here in Basel the only port in Switzerland. All those outstanding performances in construction and technology as well, of course, enable us to move and to fly around in an unprecedented scale which goes worldwide along with the increasing overload of most of the transportation networks, up to the notorious gridlocks affecting the health of both humans and the environments, and leading to the well-known paradoxical situation: if all is on the move, moving is not possible anymore. So this is an image of Moscow that I took a few months ago. As stated at the beginning, we need to discuss and implement bold and courageous innovative mobility concepts. Emerging trends in mobility have been a major thinking point in recent years. But how to anticipate future states of mobility and of complex urban systems is a non-trivial undertaking, and one that can be typically approached and outlined by scenario thinking. To keep it simple and short, I'd like to describe next a few conceivable scenarios as basis for a reflection. Scenario A, we have been seeing images, we know this all, is a society with the promises of unlimited mobility with corresponding effects on the environments and on the climate, and with an inevitable increase of physical mobility by 2-digit growth rates is definitely not an option. The outcome being quite foreseeable, namely as a dystopian global urban stillstand. Let's now consider the opposite scenario, with a generally decreasing importance of the automobile as a motorized mode of transport and as a status symbol. Not having to commute, not having to travel as the new luxury. Preferred transport modes would then be public transport systems, slow traffic on foot and bicycle. A rapid and significant decrease in traffic would be the logical consequence of this. This scenario has low probability to become reality. Scenario C, the Far East way of life, increasingly practiced in Asian megacities like Tokyo and Seoul. All activities exclusively from home, living home, office home, online shopping from home, food service delivered at your home, etc., correspondence courses. This scenario may lead to a possible decrease of demands for transport. In a radical contrast to C is the fourth scenario, namely the self-driving car, the autonomous automobile becoming the so-called third place besides living and working, where traffic jam does not matter because all activities can be carried out inside the car. Living, napping, dining, shaving, working, phoning, etc., shopping online, etc. The car as a takeaway room becoming finally the problem at hand. The use of smarter or cleaner or whatever wagons might have a positive impact on traffic jams, yet postpones the inevitable degradation of the fabric of urban spaces. To put it more prosaically, everyone expects a clear run on unobstructed roads. Everyone takes safe bike routes, lanes separate from car lanes as granted. Everyone finds it quite normal to find the next public transport stop in closest proximity. All this and a lot more as a fruitful attempt to square the circle. Whichever scenario will prevail, mobility will be changing and mutating for sure. Societies and cities are dynamic systems, constantly transforming themselves. As for now, new priorities have to be set, mainly the protection of the environment and of the climate. As an architect and territorial planner, I will focus on the effects that mobility has on the settlement structure and its development. Based on 4 concrete examples that I will show, I'd like to present corresponding solutions approach. Urban planning is an action-oriented and interdisciplinary discipline. The analysis of problems and conflicts lead to scenarios, strategies, and concrete proposals. particularly for long-term visionary projects, the aspiration must be made comprehensible and plausible. Architectural and urban projects are not provable. They need to be plainly explained and justified. This said, there is no patent remedy. The planning of the territory cannot be translated into general purpose solutions, nor can it be planned at the drawing board or on the computer alone. It is about dealing with concrete, spatial, structural concepts as well as with social behavioral patterns. Next, I will introduce a few pathways in form of questions, and followed by specific examples which describe general topics illustrated by some current focal areas of urban and territorial planning in the metropolitan region of Basel. What are the spatial effects on our increasing mobility needs? Here I show the project, I present this project of Herzog about the metropolitan train concept in Basel, where we have analyzed the city of Basel with its activities and understood that there are some voids within the city, voids that are not connected with the train system, with the metropolitan train system. Something which should be obvious, which should be clearly clear, but which is, especially in Basel, quite a difficult undertaking. And we have been developing here, together with engineers, this city map showing how the city can be linked together. And what was quite a breakthrough is from the moment on when we not only were talking as engineers, but when we were talking as architects, as city planners, and showing what could it be concretely within the city as a bus, as a stop for the metro station. Then do we have to rethink the relation between space and traffic? Yes, because as I said before, transport infrastructures, they are very space consuming. So we think that it should not be anymore on the disadvantage of the landscape in the middle, but to find new ways how to enlarge, if necessary, new infrastructures. There is a possibility to build over, to build along, also train station, some examples which are maybe not yet the right one, and of course also road infrastructures, mainly highways, also separating the city and being a hindrance, being a really a big wall within the city and separating parts of the city. Do we have to rethink the relationship between space and traffic, understanding that the growth will happen? According to Switzerland, to the Swiss government, something like for freight transport, plus 37%. So again, here, this is not something that should be enlarged on the ground, but there is an interesting concept to have a cargo metro, which all the goods can be transported from one point to another underground, all automized. And as a Swiss concept, again, this typical Swiss cross system with the east-west and the north-south, and to have this cargo metro between the main cities of Switzerland. Arriving to Basel, we think that it should not be just logistical aspect, but it should also have an urban, so that it attracts not only logistics, but also urban activities as a whole. As an example here, Markthalle Basel built end of the 20s, where this whole market was not just the market, but had also some other activities like shop, offices, and housing. So creating new hotspots within the urban fabric. Then can urban planning, you mentioned it already, Simon, planning contribute to a sustainable traffic system? Can a polycentric and mixed-use development contribute to a decrease of traffic volumes? I show this. I show a project we have been developed at Herzog and Meuron, and which is currently now in the planning at the Nordspitze, in the south of Basel, densifying an area which has been logistics or was monofunctionally used for just for shopping mall or whatever, and to create here a new urban neighborhood, mixed use. You already showed this, Jan. You know, that's the modernistic way of thinking the city, with have different functions, living, working, etc., separate, segregated, and in between undefined spaces. And rather to do now the polycentric approach, where you have all the different activities closer together, so that you create with this the short way, the short paths city, the short mobility. An image of the ground floor. We provide green space, which is very little in this area, so green space on the ground. And what makes this project also quite interesting, we stack. So on top of the shopping mall, of the shops, we have a roof with not only a green field, with a green garden, but also with, hopefully, public activity like a school or a kindergarten, so that to attract people, this is on the roof of the building that you show here. Can we show here? Yeah, you see it here in the background. So I just need 1 minute more. Manuel, if I get it?
You get it.
Okay. As a conclusion, as a matter of fact, among many other things, traffic is nowadays pretty much beyond control. Beyond doubt, we have all to think and act beyond old paths. Before the situation is entirely beyond remedy, still for me, it is beyond question that our society is able to make contributions that go beyond words, and this is definitely within our reach. In the line with this, the most relevant challenge today is to unlock our minds and to have the courage to leave the worn paths. What is the future of mobility, if you ask me? In 3 words, I would say it's shared, it's clean, and it's active. In other words, make transportation available and affordable for all, energy efficient and duty-bound, bodily and healthy. And this is what it is, in my sense, what about innovative mobility should be about. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you for these thoughts that and the very exciting projects and the thoughts that you shared with us. I would like to maybe take this discussion through various topics. One will be questions of technology and the environment. A second will be the question of the quality of urban spaces or regional spaces and their interdependency. And lastly, the notion of implementation. How do we get things done in this country? But I would like to start maybe with the future. And Alexander, maybe as an expert on the future, I don't know, on the expert on traffic technologies. Jan shared images in the beginning of his presentation. You called them gimmicks. And Pierre sketched out 3-4 scenarios of how mobility can develop in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. What do you take? What is your take on this notion of how technology will actually change or not even change our relationship to mobility, and what do we actually want?
It's very difficult to look into the future, and people from ages know this. And so I wouldn't be that stupid to tell you, oh, by the year 2025, we're going to have this, and by 2030, it's going to be like this. What I try to do in my research, but also in my teaching, is also to look back, to look forward. So what I do with the students at ETH is, and also at FHNW, is really to think about how transport infrastructure and technologies have shaped the cities in the past, because this will teach us something about the future. And Pierre showed it very nicely, but he did not really mention speed, or he did not point at it. And it's really a question of speed. So how big a city is directly dependent on the speed of our means of transport. So if you think of Atlanta, for example, a US city, has been built up on individualized mobility, flat terrain, and speeds maybe 60, 70 kilometers per hour. And that's why it's so big. Why is this? We can look back into the history of human beings, and they travel about 1 hour, 1 hour 20 a day. Never mind whether it was our ancestors in Ethiopia or whether it's us today. It's about 1 hour 20 a day. Obviously, there are people who are traveling less and people who are traveling further. But it's really how fast you can be in this hour what makes the size of your city. Now, we expanded our city sizes tremendously, but for what good? We use much more energy, and we spend more time in enclosed spaces. Limiting what a city is all about is the transaction of human beings, that we can meet, exchange ideas, exchange goods, and so on. And so with that notion, we really need to think about where do we want to go. And that's another point I would like to make is, so far in the past, and this is like this forecasting technique that has been proposed by RAND Corporation, that was actually military scenario thinking, and then later on by Shell, in the middle of the oil crisis, they came up on the idea that they should think about into the future a bit more. And what in planning is now really an increasingly important topic is backcasting. And we have the most important topic that we have to solve today is obviously climate change. And climate change is such a nice backcasting example, because we know by 2040, or maybe by 2050, the earlier the better, we need to be at zero CO2 emissions. And that's the goal. And now from there, we need to hop back and think about, we have the entire set of technologies that we have today, as Gehl explained it, that we can sort of feel will be there, autonomous vehicles, drones, and other transport technology. And now is really the question, how we bring this all together in that complex system of the existing and the new, to come up to the solution that is agreeable for the entire society. And that's a tremendous, difficult task that we need to solve together, that we can't solve in our disciplines, but where we need to talk transdiscipline. And so this is really, I think, the challenge, to look back, learn, set the future, and think about how we can get there.
I still want to kind of hook in one more time and maybe pick up the comment of Jan with the gimmicks. How do you share that sense that the technologies that are being introduced are mere gimmicks that don't actually change anything?
No, I don't agree. Depends on what you define as a gimmick. The problem is the existing. We have our existing cities, and we can't change or replace all the houses. We have been building for motorized cities, and obviously we should push hard and as hard as we can to get as fast as possible away from that path. But still there are people living in their houses where it is very difficult to come at with public transport. So in such a transition path, as in backcasting, we need to think of how can we, for example, use electric cars, which are much more energy efficient, for maybe in the next 20 years. But still have the long-term thinking in our head that at some point maybe we should actually also give up certain areas that are populated today, but too densely, or that we can densify those areas to actually have energy more efficient and more transaction spaces.
Christian, you are involved in planning the kind of transport strategy for overall Switzerland, and Switzerland is maybe one of the most densely planned and most well-organized traffic systems, or has one of the most well-organized traffic systems in the world. We heard from Pierre, we heard from Alexander and Jan, and I wonder sometimes if traffic gets too good, if it's almost too smoothless, too easy, you run into a danger of doing everything everywhere, of living on the top of the mountain because the city center is just half an hour away. The notion of speed that Alexander brought in, and the notion of the smoothlessness of traffic, how do you take that into consideration? And doesn't it lead to maybe a suburbanization or agglo of the whole country?
I think that was the experience of the last decades, that we had this suburbanization. I think it's important. It's difficult to explain. I think we should not forget that we have some benefits from this mobility system we have in Switzerland and in other cities. So the economy has grown quite a lot with that mobility system, but with these negative side effects of this suburbanization. And currently we are thinking on how to have a good mobility system and have no negative effects. That's not easy. Maybe I would like to come to this disagreement a bit between you two. Because I agree that the technical gimmicks do not change the world, but they might change the world. And the current time is quite interesting for traffic engineers because we know quite a lot is changing. The digitalization is arriving in the mobility sector. But we actually don't know how fast some of the things are changing or in which direction they are moving. And here I agree with you. We need policies. We don't know. We know a bit what kind of technologies are around, but we don't know how you can put them together to a service or to new kind of modes of transport, maybe. And this we don't know yet, how the Switzerland is there not alone. It's not the only decision of Switzerland how this is transforming this system. But with the policies, especially in the cities, we have quite a strong feature to influence what's be done in the future. So we have quite with good policies, we can influence the solutions which are growing. So if a federal state, for example, gives clear indication what are our goals, maybe the technology also tries to deliver these solutions.
Jan, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you have worked in cities. The transformation of cities, the urban space is making cities livable. I would claim, and I think this has also come out with the input of Alexander and Christian, that and also what Pierre was showing, the infrastructure system, for example, the Güter-S-Bahn that connects Zurich and Basel, or that will connect Zurich and Basel. We can say that Switzerland is a fully urbanized country. It is so densely interconnected that we can't speak of individual cities maybe anymore, but we need to conceive and think of the whole country. If you would not plan and intervene in a single city, but if you would take Switzerland as a country, as your playing field, with your ideas of making Switzerland a livable, not a livable city, but bringing your strategy to the territory of the country, how would you proceed?
I remember once in London at a discussion where we discussed transportation and mobility. And there were very many opinions, and everybody was very upset because the bicycles were awful and they were illegal, and the car drivers were bad, and the bus drivers had no culture and whatever. And then suddenly it was suggested that instead of discussing mobility and which type of, that we discuss what kind of cities, what kind of lives do we want to live, what kind of cities would we want to have. Then suddenly the whole discussion changed, and everybody was, I cannot pinpoint what they were pointing at, but sometimes if we focus away from the mobility, how to get from here to there, to what kind of setting do we want to grow up in and live in and be old in. That kind of discussions is also very important and should be linked closely with the mobility, also because, as we heard here, that the mobility structures, they really interfere with the quality of life we can have. So it was not a coincidence that I mentioned Venice, because in Venice they never had the joy of having automobiles, and they found a way anyway. And I mentioned that Venice with some good subway could be a fine model, and then there will be in between models, but we should focus really on what will be a good city in the 21st century with a very heavy demand on us to do something about the climate, the energy consumption, and the way we live, where more emphasis should be put on values and activities which are not so consumer heavy as we're used to. So we have a fantastic overall challenge, also in Switzerland, of course.
But Venice, I mean, we all love the city. It's amazing. But Venice has one, or many differences, of course, but let me pick out one, which is, of course, its disconnect from the hinterland. It is amazing when you walk through the streets and canals, but to go to Mestre takes half an hour, 45 minutes, and it's really like entering another world. Whereas when we look at Basel, we want to achieve the opposite. We want to really bring and weave together Saint Louis, Huningue, Weil am Rhein, and so on, with the core city, that there is not this 5-kilometer bridge that you have to cross.
When I mention Venice, we can also talk about pearls on a string. And my point is that all the places you mention here in Basel, it's so important that each of them should have its own life, its own qualities, that my whole world could be in this place. And then you can link them also. So it's so important that we think about places of great quality for people to live and develop. And then we also need to communicate with other places. There should be hearts. And that's why I love Venice, because I think that if Venice was linked with some infrastructure which doesn't ruin the city to other places, it could be a perfect pearl in a necklace of fine places to live.
Pierre, what?
No, it's so difficult because, first, there is no, as I said, there is no recipe, I think. There is no pretending that's it and that's not it. So I'm very careful in that. If you look back now, again, modernity, why did the SIAM or the architects at that time, urbanists, proposed that? Because the cities were unhealthy, they were loud, they were stinky. That was a reason why they wanted to have more green. There was no green spaces. So that was a reaction on something. And now we have the reaction on this sprawl, mainly in the developed, in the countries of the so-called first world. And now there is a kind of other direction, not outwards, but more inwards into the cities. And I'm sure in 50 years there will be some other things, so I would be very, very careful in saying, now we have it, and so. That's one thing. The other thing, I think, the wealthier, the greener. I think we can say that. So this green movement and this look for the environment is mostly in more developed countries because we also can afford. There is also in innovation business, which I think we should have. We always have been innovation, creativity and innovation. We have a problem, what do we do? And I think liberal economies are quite good at that. And we should highlight this, we should support that. And from a geopolitical point of view, I think it's stupid to have the fuel, not only because of CO2 emissions, but also it's ridiculous to be dependent on whoever, but to be here independent from other energy sources. I think that should be also one of the targets. And the debate is important. I think that's why this format is good, so that one can debate, one can understand what is the impact of this or the impact of that. That's why I would be also very cautious and to define what will be the future. But surely, I think people will still want to move. I'm not sure about speed, if speed is the only thing. I think this can also have a mindset. We can recalibrate this within ourselves. That's why I showed this image of A to B. Is that the only goal in our lives? Maybe also like a Chinese way to look at it, the transport or the way from A to B is as important as the fact that I want to go from A to B. So it's so complex and so the minds of the people, the pattern, the behavior, and they change because they suffer from something, whatever it is. And then you can have a mindset because I think everyone wants to have a better life. And in a democratic system, as we are, I think, than Denmark or in Western Europe, this is only possible if you can bring the people with you. That's why I said it needs to be plausible. You need to explain why you should do rather this than that. Another system is in China with the one party. They have completely different possibilities to say now we cut the traffic, or only every 2 days you can go to Beijing, or whatever they do, But we have to handle all those different issues within the society.
Christian?
I think it's also important to see that we all have different starting points. And I think the starting point in Switzerland is that we had a really, really good mobility infrastructure. And now we are realizing that just adding new infrastructure does not solve our problem. We realize that it's, on the one hand, it's getting more and more expensive to build new infrastructure. You have to go underground. Overground is almost not possible anymore. It's normally also just the problems shifting around. So I think now we realized, and I think that's common sense here on the podium, that we have to change also a bit the system. It's not only, I completely agree with Pierre that we have to talk about better and more efficient use of the existing infrastructure. And I think that's the point where we really have to go in the next years, and especially also use the modern technology to better use of the existing infrastructure. And when I talk about efficiency, I think a part of the efficiency is also quality of life. And I think this is also now a bit common sense. The more you discuss with people in urban areas, they agree that this is the right direction. The more you are dependent on a vehicle, the less you agree with that quality of life, because where you live at the moment, there is a good quality of life normally. Just in between there, where you make the problems with your vehicle, there the quality of life is bad.
But we also become dependent on technology. We are, we are so tied to things like that that have taken over in 5-6 years. Pierre sketched out these scenarios, and I would like to come back to them. And maybe even if I sound stubborn, also come back to the gimmicks. Maybe it's my boyish fascination with them, because I pose it as a question: am I wrong when I say that they do change, or they do have the potential to change urban space? Because maybe we don't step out of the car anymore, or maybe we send our car to do our groceries and we don't step out of the apartment anymore. This was one of your scenarios, the chubby guy doing everything from his desk.
Talk to the doctors about that.
Yeah. So these are, of course, exaggerations, but they can be sometimes very helpful.
They are quite
and
present yet already.
They might be present,
Of course.
Should we prepare ourselves for that? Should we prepare ourselves for the driverless car?
I guess so, yes. Because there is a difference in life cycles. The life cycle of a smartphone is about 2 years. Maybe some of us have it 4 years, but then there is a new model that can do new things. With a car, it's about 10 to 15 years. With a building, I hope your building's gonna stay there for a bit longer than 50 years, but most of them gonna be redeveloped in one form or the other in 50 or 100 years. Obviously, the old cities have a longer history, but the newer ones have a higher turnover rate. So now the question is, have we built around cars? And I think we build way too much of our cities around cars, but we have done so. And I think there is a risk that we build our cities around autonomous vehicles too much. But we need to think, because of those different life cycles, if we, for example, design a parking garage, how many lots do you need? How many lots do you need today? And how many lots do you need tomorrow? Depending on different technology passes, but also depending on where we want to go. What is our livable city, our goal? And so, again, taking up my position from the first round, we need to think more in scenarios that lead to a common established goal. That can be the livable city, that can be the city without CO2, that can be the city where no one needs to travel further than 30 minutes, and so on. And we need to define as a society what those goals should be, and then come to the next step, and I think then everybody can agree, and then to the next step to think how can we sort of put pieces together to reach there, or at least to come closer to that destination. Reaching there would be like the entire path, which would be stupid again, because technology will change, our behavior will change, our intents will change, but at least we are going in the right direction. And we have collectively decided to do so.
Yeah, I was thinking about a tendency in the history of mobility in the last 100 years. There's been this strong tendency that the mobility infrastructure actually interferes with the quality of life in the settlements, in the villages, in the cities. Just to mention one example, of course you showed these freeways going through cities and the big railway things, but even in the ordinary street, the more cars you have in that one, the less the children will play in the street. They don't play there no more, because the car and the parking has taken over in every single space. So we always have had this conflict between mobility and maybe stalled mobility, the parked vehicles, and the basic quality of life where the old people can go for walks, which the doctors recommend. We have not talked too much. We saw this picture from the guy in Japan. He really needed some exercise. And we know now that the doctors are very adamant. They say one of the major problems now is sitting syndrome. And we shall make everything so that people walk or bicycle 1 hour every day. And that will be a much cheaper health system than anything else we can find out. So we have a number of issues we shall solve at the same time. I'm not against these at all. Against man is very fertile, and he comes up with all these gimmicks, all these new ways of doing things. All we could be smarter this way or the other way, and I think that man will always do that, and that the really important thing is that we should find out what of it can we use, what of it can make real improvements, and not what is available and what can these guys sell. And I pointed also to this other problem, that these discussions we are having here is entirely for this part of the world, but the major problems are in the other end, where it will be impossible to realize if the transportation in Dhaka will be ever done by autonomous vehicles or vehicles at all.
Also, I strongly agree with thinking in scenarios. The administrations have quite a difficult job at the moment, because we have to think about what can go wrong. So we have to make restrictions on the one hand, but we want to use the technology for the good things. And actually, we don't know yet what are the good things or what is possible. And
that may be one of the problems.
No, but I think the thinking in scenarios is good. When you think about the automatic car. Huh? When we use it like today, then we really have a problem, because then my wife sends me the tennis racket I have forgotten with the car to my office, and then we have much more traffic. We have not less cars, we have more traffic and the same amount or even more cars. If you use it in a bit more intelligent way, like we share it, or we have a kind of a fleet we can use, then we have much less cars, so we have not a problem with the space for the cars. They drive around a lot. Huh? And we assume you drive around more because the mobility price goes down. So maybe that's also not the solution for the cities. Yeah. For the cities, it's clear, and I think this is also an assumption that for mass transport, we will always use bigger vehicles, buses, or especially trains, urban metropolitan railways, not small vehicles.
Yeah. I want to come back, or I want to turn to one topic before we run out of time, which is the idea of implementation. We are living in a democracy. I think all of you mentioned that in your inputs. And sometimes we have the idea that it is so bloody slow. You spoke about speed, but this is a very different kind of speed. And things, you see construction sites everywhere, but nothing ever happens. No, Herzog, I came to Basel 2005. This was already almost an old idea. It's still not happening. We can ask, is our direct democracy reaching its own limitations? How do we use the systems of direct democracy? We see things happening. You mentioned Moscow, where the mayor decides and that's it. How do we play, or how do we kind of use the democratic system to do master plans that are huge and that are very, very complex?
Also, in this regard, I'm pretty pragmatic, because I understand our cultures and our society is just the one that will sustain. And what is more sustainable than another one in a kind of a political system? Is it our liberal democratic system, even the hyper-democratic system like we have in Switzerland, with Initiativen, with referendums, with 26 cantons, etc., which is so highly, so you find almost or always someone who is against it. Is not difficult. But we want that. We want to trade, we want to discuss, we want to find, maybe you can call it compromise, or you find something, a common like denominator, or what defines this society, how this society wants to live together. So it's rather a bottom-up system than a top-down. If you mention Moscow, if I mention China, this is much more top-down. I will not also bet which will be more successful in the future. We don't know. There's always also a shift to be more autocratic or more open concepts. So in terms of, I think here in Switzerland, this is what we can. We can listen, we can take into account what the other says, even if you are not agreeing, but you find a kind of a possibility to live together. And of course, this is stressful. I'm impatient, believe me, and for me it's always much too long. And there I come back to what I said, is to make things plausible. You have to show, what do you want? What do you want? So you ask, do you want to be fast, or do you want to be whatever, to have a lot of green or whatever? What do people want in their environment? That's, I think, the main question, and that's what will be the outcome.
Yeah, but you formulated it in a very polite way.
Where?
Now, because I know your impatience. Your pragmatic approach to Switzerland. You did formulate it in a very polite way because, for example, the Herzog. How could it be implemented faster, or what went wrong? That it is not yet implemented.
It was not explained in a convincing language. It was not explained that the city needs links. You need to link people from there to there with a public transport. Further, the positive thing is public transport. That you have to understand. Then, if you have this public transport system, which is regional, it has to go right into the center, because you cannot make a circle around the center, because otherwise you have then, like Venice, you have maybe nice places but nobody in it, or there you have too many because there are so many tourists.
Yeah.
But it's to make the city livable, is to have those different stratas, those different levels, or Schichten, oder, of living possibilities. That's what makes a city livable, and not to have like just a one. But there was not an agreement between, for instance, Basel-Land. Now that's maybe a little bit too going into detail. Basel-Land and Basel-Stadt were not agreeing. Then you have the German side, then you have the French side, then the SBB didn't want that. There are so many reasons not to be for it. And now to bring everything together was a huge achievement, and now we have to implement it and to realize it, of course.
Jan, before I open it to the audience.
Yeah, I've had the privilege to work in a number of cities in very different political situations and seen enormous differences. I'll not come into the differences. Maybe I'll mention that the worst place was London, where actually after 20 years nothing has happened. They're still discussing whether in committees whether they should go this way or that way or that way. But in all these places, so different they are, I found that a lot of information of the public is really the key to getting anything moving, because people cannot ask for things they don't know about, and we really have to be very careful informing our citizens about the options, and then I trust really that they can choose the better options if they are properly informed. So really public education and information of the public is crucial, and we've really experienced that in the various cities, except in London, where nothing has happened.
And I think innovation...
They're still discussing it in Parliament.
Innovation is in the world where you have the digitalization and globalization, which makes people so unsecure. You know what is happening. So if you have to decide for A or B, you rather take the thing you know. So you are not ready to be open-minded, and so you protect more your habits and your behavior rather than to be open and to find out maybe there is a better solution. So, but this again only by explaining and...
Christian, as a politician who's here not as a politician, do you want to have a comment on that?
I think I can defend it as an administration guy. I want to defend our system a bit, because maybe our steps are not big, but we are steadily moving in the same direction. In other countries, they are moving once there and then once there. They're changing quite a lot. And I think one of the strengths of our system is that when you convince the people once, then you can really go forward. And that's a bit the point. We are, when you compare Basel with Zurich, Zurich had the same problems with their suburban railway during 50 years, but they were just 20 years ahead of us with all the discussions. They also lost twice public vote on a metropolitan railway, twice, and we have not yet voted. So that's
and on the stadium.
Sorry?
And on the stadium.
Yeah, okay, there we are also fast. Better architects.
The steadiness and the stability of Switzerland is certainly its major strength. I would like, even though we only have a very, very few minutes, to open it to the audience and maybe collect one or maximum two questions, if there are. Who has something burning? Whose hand is raised?
Is it working? Yeah? Okay. We can translate. You can also ask in German.
The chief of the matter here, Simon, said I should say something. There is very much things to talk about, and one of the most important things were just dedicated from Mr. Gehl. That's a question to come so far that the people can understand what will be done. I came in the 60s, last century, to Basel, and there was a discussion and proposals to combine, to make S-Bahn to the airport, the Tri-National Airport. And you know what has happened? Nothing has happened. They have 10,000 parking places, and they are planning 2,000 more. And the connection to is only with buses. And nobody had tried, I think, to talk to the people that we have to build an S-Bahn to this airport. And this is the main question and the main problem for me. I was in this job for 30 years to tell the people what you will do and how you will do it, when and why. And that's the main question. And I think in our region there is not enough information about these things for the three parts of French, German, and Swiss.
Right. This is more a comment than a question, but thank you. This is very important. There's one
Can I
over there.
respond to the comment quickly? Very quickly. I'm talking about gimmicks. Fascinating example of how our digitalization gimmicks can help us. For example, if we can, and I think education is very important, or education just translating what the planners have thought of when they came up with a design, is visualization. Visualization of how this thing looked like. And we have now tools with augmented reality, with virtual reality, with simple movies that can be pushed out with a button to tens of thousands of people, and tens of thousands of people can reply to it. This is like a critique with the entire city, and we are not using it yet. So we need to go forward on that front.
No,
Thank you. We have one question here.
Yes, hello, my name is Stephanie Hamburger, and I'm doing real estate development and marketing. 10 years with my own company, and I just inspired by actually Jan Gehl. I'm doing the Quorum now in Zurich, and I found out a solution where I'm probably with you that needs a new approach. And I heard Jan saying, we need the people in the cities to be happy. And I actually have another question. I'm a younger generation, and I just ask, why does everybody need to be in cities? Why don't you have another approach asking, if people stay out of cities, we can reduce transport costs, and we have more happiness in actually the agglomeration of cities, of big cities, if we stayed out, if we had all the infrastructure that cities provide us. So I think we might have to think about a change of why do everybody have to be inner cities instead of staying out cities and having infrastructures who would provide the shopping sceneries we love in cities. We have places where we can meet people because the outside is boring. So that's actually the thing why everybody wants to work and live in the inside of cities. So I have a new idea about changing that. That's actually a new project I'm doing.
Jan.
I have bad news for you. And that is that it is found without any doubt that the more people move into cities, the better we can actually work with the climate challenge, because it can be done much more efficient. All the systems of service and of heating and of transportation, everything, if we are living close. So there is this strong tendency around the world that people are living in cities. It's going from 50 to 70 to 80%. And that's good news for the climate, but we will then have to make the cities extraordinarily livable. They could be fantastic places to live, where you can have all the goodies of the city and the landscape. We better solve that problem.
Great. I was told we are actually now already over time, that the electricity will be turned off any second. So I would like to hand over for a last word to Simon, who will close this conversation, and maybe afterwards we'll have a chance informally to still accept questions.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I think this was really interesting. Unfortunately, we lack of time so often in these kind of formats. Once it's getting really interesting, we tend to be at the end. So what did we learn? I mean, Pierre said it, there is no recipe. I think that's one thing. If we want to bring it back to the question of where we are in Basel and this huge transformation we are facing, then, I mean, talking about speed, and I start to realize that as well as for the topic of mobility itself, we also have a question of speed, as the transformation is probably happening, even though it's quite slow in architecture and construction, faster than the transformation of the space in between the transformation zones. So, I mean, if you're talking about the Herzog and the S-Bahn, and we see how slow this is actually happening, then we realize that we do have to focus as much as on the zone where actually something is happening, as much as onto the zones in between. And that's where, again, politics come into play, and that's probably where we have to keep on working. So I think that's interesting, and I think we're going to maybe stick around for a couple of minutes at least, and so that we can have more informal discussions if someone has more questions or remarks. Thank you everybody for coming, and let's do that again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.